So in this short talk, I'm going to talk about the movement of the ankle joint, which follows on from some of the principles we discussed previously. And what I really want to talk about is a few things. So I want to talk about the anatomy of the talus and the mortise, the intermalleolar axis and the role that plays, the radius of curvature of the talus, and again, the role that plays in movement of the talus. Talk a little bit about the frustrum, which is a topic many might find frustrating, and just touch upon how this all generates a coupled movement. So let's start with the shape of the tibia. So the shape of the tibia, if you look at the cross section on the axial plane from the undersurface, you'll see that there's a large anterior surface, a relatively large lateral surface, a slightly smaller medial surface, and a slightly smaller posterior surface. This is not obviously drawn to scale. Then here you have your medial malleolus. And of course, on this side, you have your fibula. So that side's longer, and that side's longer. And that's kind of important because it means that there's more room in the front for when your ankle and your talus dorsiflexes up than there is in your back. So this automatically dictates the possible shape of the talus. Now, we're going to just go on one slide, and we're going to show the position of the fibula here. So just trying to draw that to show you the incisura as well. So we have a long section there, a long section there, a slightly narrower section there, and a narrower section here. And you have your little fibula at the back over here. And here's your medial malleolus. Now, the reason this is important is because if that's anterior and you were perpendicular to that plane, that's the plane of the tibia. However, the intermalleolar axis, which is from the middle of the fibula to the medial malleolus, is offset from that, and that's about 20 to 23 degrees or something. So the exact number doesn't matter, but the idea is that it's slightly that way. And also, because this bit is wider at the front, you have a gutter angle and a gutter angle, and if you bisect that gutter angle, you find that you're slightly externally rotated. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second. It's really important, this little external rotation that you have because of the intermalleolar axis. And the reason it's important is because it helps determine the foot progression angle. Because you're slightly externally rotated in your tibio-talar joint, your talus has to be externally rotated. The reason that's important is because if you remember from the last talk, when you walk, your heel hits the ground, then you need to feel the lateral side to balance yourself and accommodate to the ground before rolling onto your medial side, which is rigid for propulsion. And as we said, form reflects function. So everything's really efficient and everything's made in a certain way to try and progress you forward through your gait. So the foot progression angle is called the foot progression angle because it helps you progress forward. So if you're slightly externally rotated, you will land on your heel, then land on the lateral aspect. And then because of your direction of travel is slightly different to the direction of your foot, you automatically roll onto the medial side without doing anything. Whereas if you were dead straight on, you'd hit your heel and then you wouldn't land on the lateral side first. You'd land straight forward first, which is harder to accommodate to. And it's even worse if you're internally rotated or in-toed, because then you land on the medial column first, which is your rigid bit first. So that completely upsets your balance. So the very shape of the tibia and the intermalleolar axis helps determine your foot progression angle, which helps your efficiency of gait. So back to what we were talking about. Now, the shape of the talus. So let's turn our pointer back on. Now, with the shape of the talus, it's got to match the tibia, hasn't it? So we've got a wider anterior, we've got a slightly wider lateral, a slightly narrower medial, and then a narrower posterior. And then you've got your talar neck. Now, it's just important to note that basically the articular surface on this area is a little bit bigger, and that's because it's got to articulate with the medial malleolus. And the articular surface here is a little bit smaller, but that's just the articular surface. And then you have your lateral process and you have your posterior process. One thing to note, obviously, here you have a wider anterior than posterior. You also will note here that if that's the axis of the tibia, you'll see that the neck is slightly internally rotated. Okay, so we're going to pause there again for a second. It's fairly obvious that the anterior bit has to be wider to accommodate, and that's important because it means that when the ankle dorsiflexes up, the wider talus sits well in with the mortise, inside the mortise, and it locks things in place. And that's important because when you're walking and you're pushing off and you're going forward, your ankle dorsiflexes, and when it dorsiflexes, it needs to be really stable to push off. Whereas when you're standing and reaching out with your foot to try and feel the ground in front of you, you go into plantar flexion, you want a bit of wiggle room to be able to adapt to the ground. But why is this talus slightly internally rotated when we just said we need a foot progression angle? Well, it's because the foot progression angle isn't 20 degrees externally rotated. It's a little bit less than that. And your intermalleolar axis is about 20 degrees. And that has an advantage because it helps the way your foot goes up and down. But your foot doesn't actually have to be 20 degrees externally rotated. So there's some compensation in the rest of your foot. And there's obviously some benefit to this with the shape of the subtalar joint, etc., which we're not really going to go into right now. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the radius of curvature. So if you look at the talus from the sagittal view, so we were looking at it from the axial view before, if you look at it from the sagittal view, and this is the medial aspect, yes, the articular surface is bigger, but the actual radius of curvature over here, which articulates, is small. If you look at it from the lateral view, the talus shape is slightly different, and the radius of curvature over here is much bigger. What this means, if you translate that back into the talus from the axial view, is that you have a narrow radius of curvature here, a large radius of curvature here, and that's the talar head and neck. And that forms a little, well, if you extended it, it would form a cone. But a frustrum is a cone with a bit sawed off. So this bit here, which is what is of interest to us, is called a frustrum. So what does a frustrum mean? So this here is an example of a frustrum with a talus. And what it means is if you're on a horizontal surface here and you were to plantarflex, so that's rolling your talus forward, your talus would naturally also go inwards. And if you were to dorsiflex, so your talus rolling backwards, it would naturally go outwards. So the very shape of it allows your talus to go in and out, in and out. And that's how the radius of curvature plays into the frustrum. So what that means is eventually you end up with an ankle joint which has a slightly offset hinge. So if you were to draw the ankle joint, you would draw it like that. So that's your big toe and that's your lesser toes. And you have a little hinge like that. So basically you roll on this plane, which means that as you dorsiflex, your foot goes outwards and helps you clear the ground because you're slightly externally rotated. And as you plantarflex, your foot goes slightly inwards, which helps keep it in a slightly less locked position at the ankle, which helps you accommodate to the ground. So that was just a quick summary, and I hope you found that helpful.